Right around this time of the NBA offseason, people tend to get weird. They get really optimistic about particular teams, or they think that this team is like a sleeper championship contender. And in this video, we're going to be talking about some teams that I think are really being overrated by the NBA community for this season. We begin with a weird one. I'm going to put the Miami Heat on this list. Now, there's a couple of different reasons why I feel like people are really excited about Miami this year, because when you look at the way that their year went last year, they easily could have made the finals, and they, were a really good postseason team, and they figured out a lot of stuff late in the year. And you look at that and think, well, what if they got like full strength Kyle Lowry for the entire season? They were a team that dealt with a ton of injury issues all last year. And despite the fact that someone like Duncan Robinson, that was important to them before, barely played last year, they still figured out a way to almost be a finals team. But here's where I'm at with Miami. I have a couple of pretty major concerns. One is the Kyle Lowry thing. Like, I'm not convinced that we're going to get a really good version of Kyle Lowry moving forward in Miami. I think it's at least relatively possible that he is just too old at this point. He's going to deal with injury issues, and there's a lot of stuff going on with that. But I think that if you're trying to count on Kyle Lowry as this big positive force for Miami this upcoming season, I'm not sure that's a good bet to make. And then when you look at the rest of the roster, it's like, okay, JB's really good, but he also deals with injury issues. He also is getting older. Tyler Hero's good, but he's a one-dimensional player. He's all offense, no defense. They lose PJ Tucker, so now they're counting on guys like Caleb Martin to be starting level players for them. And as much as I like Bam, he hasn't developed enough offensively to really excite me outside of him doing, some mid-range stuff, some dribble handoff stuff, and then of course how great he is defensively. And Miami always seems to figure out a way to make this work, right? Like, it's Gabe Vincent, it's Max Strus, it's whoever else they want to bring in. But when you're talking about like a championship contending team, there's like 4 other teams in the East that I would pick over them. And there's some teams coming up at the back end of the playoff race as well that I think could overtake Miami as well. This always seems to happen with them, where we always think that they're going to be good and they're going to meet expectations, and then they have a down year. Then they come back later and they're fine. But I think this year could be that down year for Miami, losing PJ Tucker, some of the age stuff that's coming in for them, and then really trying to figure out what the rotation is if, Duncan Robinson's not playing and then Tyler Hero wants to start. Presumably he will be starting. There's just a lot of moving pieces there. And even though I think Eric Spoelstra is probably the best coach in the league and Jimmy Butler is still very good, specifically as a championship contending group, I don't quite see that for Miami this season. Next up is another Eastern Conference team, and it is the Chicago Bulls. I've mentioned this in a couple of other videos. There are a couple of things that really concern me about Chicago. First and foremost is the health of Lonzo Ball. He unlocks a ton of stuff for them on both ends of the floor, and without him last year, they just weren't very good. Now, granted, they had injury issues throughout the roster, whether it was him, Caruso, Patrick Williams, whatever the case may be. A lot of the kind of like on the edge role player, especially defender guys that they were counting on to be a good team last year, got hurt throughout the year, and they were a good team in the beginning of the season. But if Lonzo just isn't going to be healthy, this knee thing has been just a really strange situation for him. He's really struggled to overcome whatever this injury has been and recover from it properly. And if he's just not a factor for them, something that they can't count on, that's a huge issue. He can really guard. He's a playmaker. He fits in between every single other player on this roster. And then you're counting a lot more on Caruso. You're counting a lot more on the development of Patrick Williams, of Kobe White. And I just don't see that on this roster. Like, LaVine's really good. He's a great scorer. Him and DeMar play incredibly well together. And DeMar at times looked like an MVP caliber player last year. But if you're just counting on like those two guys and Vucevic, they are not a top 5 Eastern Conference team to me. They're looking at more so like a borderline play-in spot, 6, 7, 8, maybe even 9 in this Eastern Conference because of how talented this side of the league is. And I just don't love the depth of their roster and the guys that they brought in that they're really counting on to be those in-between pieces, those two-way kinds of pieces. I'm not convinced that they're going to be healthy and or continue to develop and help this group. And they don't really have a lot of other options in terms of improving the roster, given some of their, draft pick responsibilities to some other teams as a result of bringing in guys like Vucevic and DeMar. They're not going to be bad, but I think people are just assuming that they're going to be as good as they were to start the year last year. And I don't think that all the health issues they have completely solved themselves that, they were dealing with the second half of last year. Next up on the list is Dallas. Now, if you're watching, a good amount of my trade coverage this offseason, you know that I don't like the Christian Wood trade. I don't think that it's this hugely positive addition for Dallas. And anytime you go from losing Jalen Brunson, who I think the Knicks overpaid for, but still specific to the Dallas roster, was really important, especially when Luka wasn't playing. Then, of course, when Luka was playing, he was really critical to providing another offensive outlet, another guy that could create, and he plays really well on or off the ball. That was super critical to what Dallas liked to do around Luka. And now you're putting even more of a burden, even more responsibility on Luka, even with Tim Hardaway Jr. coming back, even with Spencer Dinwiddie, continuing to figure out how to play alongside Luka, bringing in Christian Wood, who in theory should help them offensively. I don't see this as a team that is going to be, continue to be an up and coming roster. They are still looking for that sidekick alongside Luka, and they still need that other guy that they can count on offensively, or at least can be like a Drew Holiday level, really good two-way player. That guy doesn't exist on the roster. Like bringing in JaVale McGee is fine. Bringing in Christian Wood is fine. Tim Hardaway Jr. coming back, Dinwiddie, Bertans out there, Kleber, Finney Smith. Like they have a lot of nice pieces, but it's not a roster that I'm looking at as one of the better rosters in the Western Conference. Again, it's a conference that's going to continue to get better. You got the Clippers if they're healthy, Denver if they're healthy. Like this could very easily be a 5 or 6 seed team, or even later if a team like Minnesota is really good this year. And I just don't think that they upgraded. And even though they made a nice playoff push last year, the roster as a whole outside of Luka isn't that impressive. If you want to try and convince me that Christian Wood is the missing piece and that he's going to be a big time playoff player, that he's going to be at a guard and he's going to be an offensive force, you can try. I'm just not in on the Christian Wood addition. And I think losing Jalen Brunson is a bigger deal than we realize. And so ultimately, I think they're a little bit overrated around the league right now. Next up on the list is Phoenix. Now for me, this is entirely a vibes selection on this list, because in theory, if you just take away the game 7 last year, like if Phoenix just takes care of business, wins game 7 and they lose in the conference finals, when they lost to Dallas, if they just go to the conference finals and lose, everything's probably fine, right? Like you go to the finals, then you go to the conference finals, and you still have some momentum here. But we've seen this throughout the years where if you lose a game 7 like that, and then you have the offseason that Phoenix has had with the Sarver stuff that has come out and the DeAndre Ayton stuff where they just didn't really want him, but they basically kept him because they had to. Chris Paul continually getting older, even though the formula is still there, like Chris Paul, Devin Booker, the wings, and Ayton. Like that formula is still there. It's a formula that won them 60 plus games last year. When you're talking about a championship contender, and a lot of people I think are just assuming that Phoenix had one bad game, in game 7, they're just going to come back and everything's going to be fine. I don't think that level of momentum exists for them. And I'm just not convinced anymore that Chris Paul is going to be able to just magically one season be really, really good in the postseason and stay healthy. And I don't know that there's enough else on this roster to support this group if they're not that devastating, late game situation team that they were last year, where if Phoenix was within a couple of points in the fourth quarter of games last year, they were winning 80% of those games because of how good they were in their late game execution with Booker and Paul. And if Paul starts to slip there, not only are you not going to be as close later in those games, but you're not going to be as good later in those games either. And as a postseason contender, I just see some liabilities on this team, whether it be Chris Paul's age, whether it be DeAndre Ayton's give a crap level / his offensive development. I don't see them as a true contender for this upcoming season, and I think most people do. And so for me, that is the very definition of overrated. And the last up is a team that I honestly feel like could probably be on this list every single year, and it's the LA Lakers. There's really no reason for optimism around this team. There's no real spin you can put on this and say, well, this is how the Lakers are going to be contenders this year. If you paid attention last year, or honestly, most of the years LeBron has been in LA, with the exception of the bubble season, there's not a whole lot positive to point to. There's either injuries or issues with the team, or a combination of the two, or bad roster management. And no matter what they do with this roster around the edges of it, as long as it still involves Russell Westbrook and or the injury risk of LeBron and Anthony Davis, I just don't see a group here that is a championship contender. And even if you told me that LeBron and AD were healthy this season, I don't know that the rest of the roster has enough to support those two guys on a championship level. Who are the wing defenders in this group that are going to guard some of the better, if they're in a series with Dallas, who's guarding Luka? You're going to ask LeBron to guard Luka the whole game? Who is the guy that you can put on the floor late in games that can guard and can shoot? Who's the guy that can sit in the corner and shoot 40% from 3-point range and not get destroyed on the defensive end of the floor? Because that's what you need around LeBron. It's what you need around Anthony Davis. And I do think that there are at least some question marks still about LeBron's ability to be that devastating offensive force still. He's getting a little bit more perimeter oriented. He's shooting more threes, which is fine. He's getting older. There's nothing wrong with that, except for the fact that if you're counting on the Lakers contenders to be a championship contending team. I think that if this exact roster with like less star power but the same caliber of roster existed in like Milwaukee, I don't think anybody would care about the Lakers. I don't think anybody would, consider them as like contenders or borderline contenders. This to me is just the market they're in, the team that they have, and the players that they have on the roster. That's the only reason people are thinking, oh, well, if you make a couple of tweaks here and you change this and that, maybe they could be contenders. They're honestly the most overrated team in the entire league to me. Even if you want to say that LeBron's healthy and Anthony Davis is healthy, there's like a 2% chance that they're championship contenders in my opinion, because the rest of the roster is just so bad. And that goes back to the non-Buddy Hield trade, the Russell Westbrook trade, a variety of different moves. And I understand that it's difficult to get, really good wings on the roster when one, every team in the league wants really good wings, and two, you're spending so much money on all these other guys and you have to try and find them with like mid-level exceptions and things like that. But the bottom line is they haven't managed this roster well over the last like 15 years. And the only reason that they're where they are now is because one, they're the Lakers, and two, LeBron wanted to go there. And there's just no history apart from the title in the bubble, which you can have a whole different conversation about. There's no history of this group and this organization in the last 15 years putting together championship caliber rosters. Okay, maybe I shouldn't say 15 years, 10 years, right? In the like slightly before LeBron and the LeBron era, there's just no history of them being a championship competitive team with the exception of the bubble year. And I find it really hard to believe that we're going to continue to get fooled by this every single year and think that just because they're the Lakers and because they have LeBron and Anthony Davis, they're contenders. They're not. They're honestly not even remotely close. In my opinion, they're way closer to being a lottery team than they are to being a championship contender. And as a result, they are getting massively, massively overrated. And that's my list. Let me know down in the comment section below what you think some of the most overrated teams are in the league this upcoming season. And I'll see y'all next time.